Welcome. Okay, so today we are looking at chapter 9, which is implementing managed code. Chapter 9 and chapter 10 are relatively short chapters, and they are more of theory to like sum up what has been considered in the previous chapters. In this chapter, there are two sections. After the introduction, we'll look at understanding managed code, what it is. And under that, I have two subheadings: Introduction to SQL Server, CLR integration, identifying the need for managed code. Then the second section is implementing managed database objects. Here we look at importing and configuring assemblies, then creating managed database objects. That's chapter 9. Okay, you might be using the older version of the book. I think in the other version, chapter 9 looks at optimization. Yeah. That has been covered as just a topic, a subsection, a section in, I think, chapter 6. Yeah. Okay. So, introduction. While using T-SQL code to manipulate database objects, implementation the implementation of logic sometimes can become complex. We did look at a number of constructs that are used in T-SQL to implement logic. Can anyone remember those constructs that we looked at? What are some of the constructs that we looked at which are used to implement logic in T-SQL? We understand what I mean by logic. What I mean is we can write SQL statements which are going to exercise some kind of reasoning. The statements are not just going to be executed in sequence, in a sequential order, one after the other. But SQL Server is going to like pause and check certain conditions before deciding on what to be done, what should be done next, what code should be executed. Okay, we did look at if-else construct, where you can implement a code where if a certain condition is true, a certain statement or set of statements will be executed. But if the condition that you have set turns out to be false, a different set of statements will be executed. Okay. Then we also looked at the while loop, where a set of statements will be executed repetitively until a certain condition is true. So until a certain condition becomes false, the condition that you have set. The third construct we looked at is the switch statement, which is like an if-else statement, only that this one, you put the condition right on top, then you put what should be done for each of the possible outcomes. Then at the end, you put what should be the default answer in case all the other preceding options turn out to be false. Okay. So T-SQL is limited in the level of complexity that you can implement in your code. You can use managed code written in a programming language supported by .NT framework. We did briefly look at .NET framework. Anyone who can remember anything about what we said it? I think in chapter 2, no, chapter 1 actually. Anything? What's a framework? Yes, friends.
In my own words,
yes,
I would say a framework is some kind of package functions and programming statements that help someone to execute or to build something faster than they would with the native code. The framework is like building a system that helps you creating a UI to help you do that user interface faster than if you're using the vanilla code itself, language itself.
Okay, so a programming framework is a set of tools that a software developer can use to build software. And these come with a number of functions. They come with inbuilt features to extend the capability of the code. These are normally referred to as classes or libraries, as well as classes are going to have what are called methods. Okay. The idea is it's intended to speed up the process of software development, as well as reducing the number of errors made or bugs found in software. Okay. So there are different types of frameworks. Those who came earlier, I showed you the one that I'm looking at, Cake PHP. That's a framework for PHP, for developing PHP applications. So you find that I don't have to write the actual PHP code most of the time, but I need to just follow certain rules to make sure that I conform to what is required for that framework. It comes with a number of libraries, and you can even add additional libraries. Library will be a collection of code which other people have created in form of classes, which will extend the functionality of your software. For example, when I'm using CakePHP, I don't need to find a way to hash the password. I just need to call to include or to evoke the class which contain the function for to implement encryption. And that's going to encrypt the password. And so you find that the process of developing application becomes faster. A lot of features are going to be automated. That's a framework. Now, Microsoft has its own software development framework, and it's called .NET Framework. .NET Framework supports a number of programming languages. Among these are C#, Visual Basic, okay, and a few others. Even some of the open source languages are supported. Okay. But this framework comes with a number of developed sets of codes which you can make use of. So you do not have to do certain things from scratch. In other words, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Okay. Now, we did look at this, I'm just trying to recap on this. So what we are saying is that a managed code is software code that is written in any of those supported languages in .NET Framework. Managed code runs in .NET CLR. Okay. It allows execution of managed code within the SQL Server environment. Okay. This provides flexibility in writing the database code in multiple languages. So you're not limited to writing your code in a specific language. It allows you to be able to program in different languages and be able to make use of that code in your database. Okay. Managed code also takes advantage of programming languages to implement complex programming logic in database objects, such as stored procedures and triggers. Understanding managed code. As a database developer, you realize that in some situations, it is not possible to implement the required functionality by using T-SQL code. It might prove to be too limited. Okay. E.g., when you need to store the credit card number in a table in an encrypted format so that it cannot be tampered with. I showed you an illustration of how information stored in a database can be encrypted. Okay. So information which is sensitive, of a sensitive nature, such as credit cards, passwords, bank account, or information which is of a personal nature, may need to be protected. And one additional layer of protection, apart from the use of username and password, is to encrypt information, that information, before saving it in the database. For this, you need to apply various string manipulations and mathematical calculations, which involve usage of arrays and constructs. We have talked about constructs. What we're saying that each programming language, whether it's JavaScript or PHP or C# or Visual Basic, they have their own, they implement almost the same constructs. The if else, do, for loop, do while loop, switch constructs, but the way they implement them, the way you write them will differ slightly. But of course, when you look at the code, if you look at most of the modern programming languages, they are going to look very similar because most of them are based on Java, which in turn was developed from C++. Okay. So to make use of such kind of constructs, you can use managed code, but you can also make use of mathematical calculations. There are a lot of functions which are available in some of these programming languages, which may not be available in T-SQL or SQL Server database engine. SQL Server lets you create programs in any .NET supported language to implement enhanced programming logic that cannot be implemented using T-SQL. Code that is written in any of the .NET supported languages and run in CLR is called managed code. Anyone, what's this acronym, CLR, what does it stand for? You guys, you need to revise, go back to chapter 1. You can embed these programs in your database so that they can run in the same environment in which the database exists. Introduction to SQL Server CL integration. T-SQL is not a complete and comprehensive programming language. Unlike other languages, T-SQL does not support features such as object orientation, arrays, collection for each loops, usage of external resources and classes. What do we understand by object orientation? Or when you say this programming language is object oriented.
I think that programming language that deals a lot with objects and methods of objects. It deals with a lot of objects.
Obviously, that's why it's called object oriented. But how do you describe it? Object oriented. The traditional way of programming is referred to as procedural. This is where code is executed following the sequence and the constructs which are in the code. Object-oriented programming is a programming concept or approach which try to envision the programming projects in such a way that you let them to real life experiences. The key concepts in object-oriented programming are objects, classes, and methods. An object is something about which you want to save information, okay? A class is like a blueprint for creating objects. So you can have a class called student, and that class of student is going to have features such as attributes like name, address, contact address, email address, phone number, and that class might also have some methods. That is what the object can do or what can be done to that object. For example, there could be a method called enroll for a class. Okay. Now, you can use that template to create users who are going to have their own maybe names, contact addresses, join different classes, okay? But it's like when they are designing vehicles, they make, well, maybe Toyota Land Cruiser, this model. They have a design, a drawing showing how each component should work, the features, the capacities, the capabilities of that model. And then based on that, they are going to produce individual Land Cruisers, which are going to look similar, but they're not identical. So, for example, they are going to have maybe different colors. Okay. They might have use different fuel. Others might use petrol, others might use diesel. Okay. And so on. So that's that's a relationship between class and object. Now, each of these objects is going to have features or properties which describe that object. A student is going to have a name, email address, maybe height, gender, courses, and so on. Those are attributes describing that student. Okay. And methods, that is, things which can be done. So this type of programming language is a newer approach to programming, and it allows there are a number of benefits, such as taking advantage of or using software that has been written. So certain activities, you are creating a web page. Someone could have written a code that will allow the software to check that a valid email address has been entered in the text box for email address. Okay, so when you are using object-oriented programming, you take advantage of that. You are able to import code in form of classes or libraries into your program. Okay. Okay, I'm not teaching about object-oriented programming. So I'm just trying to say these features are not available in T-SQL. Okay. Arrays. We did talk about this, I think, some time back. Basically, this is another way of saying matrices. An array is a variable which is used to store multiple values with a single associated name. Then you use an index to reference different elements or different parts of that variable. Okay. Collections. Collections are similar to arrays, on that they are a bit more general. Okay. And also for each loops, this is a special type of loop which is can be used. For example, you're writing an application to a web application where people are writing posts and sharing with others. So when someone logs in, you want to go to the database and retrieve all the articles which have been written and saved in the database. To do that, you can use the for loop, but that is usually very cumbersome. So in most programming languages, there is a short form which is called for each loop, which will easily retrieve the information which is saved in the database, that title, author, date, body, the main body of the post, and other associated attributes, and display them on the web page. Also, in T-SQL, you do not have the means to be able to access external resources, such as the file structure. When you are using SQL Server, you do not have control over, you cannot access specific file or folders on the hard drive, because the database engine takes care of that. Okay, but there are certain applications when you may want to have access to the folder structure. So for such cases, you can use managed code. To implement complex operations in a database, SQL Server allows you to SQL Server is integrated with .NET framework. Okay. Common language runtime is an environment, that is CLR, is an environment that executes code written in any of the .NET programming languages, such as C#, Visual Basic, and so on. CLR integration allows database developers to create objects in any of the .NET languages and embed the objects in the database. These are called managed database objects. Benefits of using SQL Server CLR integration. The first one is better programming model. The .NET programming languages provide a set of programming constructs that are not available in T-SQL. Access to classes that can be used to implement a predefined functionality. For example, binary stream reader and binary stream writer classes provided in .NET Framework Library enables you to save data in compressed format. SQL Server doesn't provide that natively to compress data. But there are times when you may want to save data in the database in a compressed format. You can take advantage of these programming languages. The second benefit is common development environment. Some development tools, same development tool, e.g. Visual Studio, can be used to create database objects and scripts. Okay. You probably may have seen this, but Visual Studio is referred to as an IDE, Integrated Development Environment. It's a set of tools that are used to program, to create applications. They're going to provide you with a number of features. Apart from being able to enter the code, they also provide error detection. They are going to provide features such as access to classes. They are going to provide features such as debugging to ensure that your code is error-free. What is debugging? How do you describe the term debugging? Or what is a bug? I think we did talk about this. When you talk about a bug, what is a bug? Yes, please.
In my own words,
yes.
I would describe a bug as some kind of and maybe a syntactical error that prevents your code from running correctly. Or if the code has been prevented from running due to mostly human error in the typing. So debugging is going through your code to make sure you correct any mistake that you may have made in order for the code to run properly.
Okay, so a bug is a mistake, an error in the software code. Now, some of these errors are not detected during the early stages of testing. The errors might occur later when the software is maybe actually running, runtime errors, okay? Now, an IDE will provide facilities to help with the process of locating and eliminating bugs in your software. So you find that they are going to underline where something is wrong. You have missed out some key word, it's going to be underlined. Or they'll provide features such as auto-completion. Auto-completion has two aspects to it, not two aspects, performs two functions. One, it prevents errors. So, because when you try to type something, it will guide you what options are available for that particular case. Two, they speed up the process of coding. So instead of you manually writing each and every letter, you are able to just select and press and accept from the options presented. So those are some of the features that you find in a software development tool. So we're saying that one of the benefits of using SQL Server, CLR integration is the ability to have a common development environment for not only for your creating database objects, but also the scripts. Okay. The third benefit is the ability to define data types. You can create user-defined data types to expand the storage capability of SQL Server. E.g., when you need to store a set of values in a single column, in which case you are going to define to make use of an array. Okay. Identifying the need for managed code. Use T-SQL statements to do the following: to perform data access and data manipulation operations that can be done using T-SQL statements. For that, you don't need to use managed code. Secondly, when you need to create database objects such as procedures, user-defined functions, or triggers, which require basic programming logic, this can easily be done using the standard T-SQL statement. But you can use managed database objects to perform the following: implement complicated programming logic for which you can reuse the functionality provided by the .NET-based class libraries. In other words, there are certain functions you may want to include in your application which have already been implemented by other people. So they have already coded, so you just need to make use of that software. And that can be accessed through what we refer to as class libraries. You use managed database objects to access external resources, such as calling a web service or accessing the file system. Now, let me just pause here. I'm pausing the recording. I don't want, you know, one of the challenges that you might face, especially when you start looking for employment, is good organizations are not going to, yes, they'll look at your qualifications, what you have, but they are also going to look at your ability to apply what you know in a real life situation. Okay. Now, I'm reminded of this because just yesterday, Electoral Commission of Zambia was conducting interviews, and someone had started with and lost her job, and she applied and she was called. So she called me last week and asked me for some tips on what to expect during the, because first yesterday they had session for aptitude tests. Then I think either Monday, that's when they have reduced the number. No, those have been selected are going to go now for further interviews. And these are some of the things that interviewers might try to test you on. What file systems do you know used by an operating system? This is outside what, just it's beside. In Windows, for example, or Linux. Because if you're going to install Windows or Linux or Mac OS, you need to choose the file system. And different file systems will have different capabilities, and others will be more suitable for certain types of applications than others. I don't know if you have done this. Sorry, I might be digressing too much, but I don't want to just give you head knowledge and then. The new version of Windows 10, the one which came out, it's in March, April this year. It has a file which is more than 4 GB. Now, if you it's easier to, on most of the computers now, to install Windows using a flash disk, USB flash disk. Now, what happens is that if you don't choose a correct format, most people, they will format their flash disk as FAT32. FAT32, that's file allocation table 32, has got one unique limitation. It cannot save a file which is more than 4 GB. So if you have, when you are trying to copy your Windows files, you have 8 GB, and you're getting an error message saying this file cannot be copied because of insufficient space. Now you wonder, how come?
Happens to me with my computer crash. I think I remember I mentioned the other time in the hospital for the lecture on the computer crash. When I was trying to copy the operating system, I was using an 8 GB flash drive. And the 5 GB operating system was using until I formatted it in different.
Okay. NTFS. So one of the common file systems is file allocation table, which was Microsoft default file system. It's now obsolete. Microsoft now uses NT file system, NTFS. Okay, they started using this in Windows NT and Windows. They standardize it in Windows 2000 because that one offers security and ability to handle larger files. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. So when you need to access a file system, whether it's FAT32 or NTFS, you can use managed database objects. So the other need or cases where you might need to use managed code is when you need to implement CPU intensive functionality that can run more efficiently, then you have to consider using managed code. Please understand what CPU is. You get questions like that in interview. Okay, I've talked for a long time. Here's a question. You might be wondering now, how are questions asked about what he has been talking about? Here is one of them. This is for the exam purposes and for understanding the contents of your syllabus. Which of the following option is supported by .NET and not by T-SQL? This one is straightforward. We spent a lot of time talking about it. Okay, I will not ask someone who hasn't put up their hands. Messi? Object orientation. The others can be done using T-SQL statements. It's object orientation. Okay. Okay, by the way, the friend I was talking about, the former classmate, called me this morning that actually they finished marking and they've called them for the second and final round of interviews this one Monday, I think. Implementing managed database objects. Every time you come across that term, just think of that as meaning creating, modifying, and deleting. Okay. To create managed database object, you should create a managed code in any .NET language. Managed code contains classes and methods that provide a desired functionality. Step 2, compile the code to create what is called an assembly. An assembly can be a .dll or .exe file that contains the compiled managed code. Again, shouldn't be new. I'd alluded to this in one of the earlier chapters. I said that when we're talking about programming languages, they are divided into different groups. Every programming language is written in a language that human beings understand. That is referred to as the source code, the human readable language. But the CPU, which is going to execute the instructions in that software, will require that those instructions are translated in what is called machine code, machine language, the language that the computer understands. Now, machine language is very, very difficult to use as a programmer because I'll be dealing with ones and zeros. And so when you make mistakes, you have to memorize a lot of things, which code is used for this command and so on. So instead of using that, the software will be normally translated or converted into an assembly language, which is like easier for the computer to understand, to translate into machine code, but also easier for you as a human being if you're looking at to understand. It's going to involve keywords like add, sub, and so on, okay? So now we say that these programming languages are normally divided into two subgroups, depending on how they convert the source code into the object code. That is assembly language or machine code. And we talked about two types. Anyone who can remember? We said there is what is referred to as compiled language and interpreted language. And the difference is this. Interpreted languages are programming languages where the code written in source code is going to be translated one line at a time during execution. Compiled languages, on the other hand, are programming languages where when you are finished writing the software, you are going to perform a special task called compilation, where the software, the instructions that you have written are going to be translated into this into the assembly language, or that's a source code, object code in one go. After that, a special file is going to be created, executable file, which you now be able to run in order to use that software. So compiled languages, the instructions are translated into object code in one process called compilation. In interpreted languages, the instructions are interpreted one statement at a time. That's the difference. Yeah. So here we're saying the second part, after you have written the code with whatever features you want, probably in Visual Basic, you have to do compilation. And the result of this is going to be some files which can be executed by the software. By the way, DLL stands for Dynamic Link Library, and .exe is for executable file. Okay. So that software which results from that process of compilation is what is being referred to as an assembly. So I'll be referring to this and a lot of subsequent statements. Okay. SQL Server cannot directly execute assemblies, that is, those executable files. So before using them, you need to import and configure them in the database engine. And the last step is then you need to create a database object based on the imported assembly, whether it's a trigger or stored procedure or user-defined function. Importing and configuring assemblies. You can import .NET assemblies by using the create assembly statement. And this is the syntax. Okay. Create assembly. This should not be very strange because we have come across this as keyword create. Create, is it assembly? Is it DDL or DML?
DDL.
That's DDL, okay. Create assembly followed by the name that you want to assign to the assembly. Authorization followed by the owner name. Like I've said before, we have come across this. Authorization is the keyword that is used as a clause to indicate which user has permission or rights to that object that you're creating. Okay. From client assembly specifier, that's the name of the code from that you have written in maybe C# or Visual Basic. And you can have more than one, and that's indicated by that. And here you are setting permissions. These permissions are not for the people who are going to run the object you are creating. That is done by that. These are permissions on what that object can do in your database. And there are three options. The first one is safe, the second is external access, and the last one is safe. Where assembly name is the name of the assembly, authorization owner, specify the name of the user or role as the owner of the assembly. Client assembly specifier, specify the path and the file name that corresponds to the assembly. Permission set, safe, external, access, and safe. Specifies a set of access code permission, code access permissions granted to the assembly. Safe, when you set the permission set to safe, then you're saying the code cannot access external system resources such as files, the network, and the environmental variables or the registry. Again, I hope we are familiar with what we mean by environmental variables or registry. Registry is a special database that Microsoft Windows operating system uses to store the configurations of the Windows system. It's hidden, and for most of the work, you don't have to deal with it directly. But there are few cases where you may need to access it. It's not safe, it's very complicated. But that's a database where Microsoft will store the settings, the software which has been installed on the machine, the information about the current user who has logged in, what they are allowed to do on the machine, what they are not allowed to do on the machine, what should be displayed on the desktop. That is saved in what is called registry. It's a hierarchical type of database. Environment variables, these are Windows or operating system variables which will store information about the system and about the user. I hope we're getting the difference. The information is saved in the registry, but the pieces of information is going to be associated with different variables, and those are the ones which are referred to as environment variables, such as the location of the home directory, that is documents, where you have documents, music, pictures, and so on. Okay. So when you use self as the permission set, it means that that code cannot access any of those. External access enables assemblies to access certain external system resources, such as files, networks, environmental variables, I made a mistake there, and the registry. The last one is unsafe. Unsafe enables assemblies unrestricted access to the resources, both within and outside an instance of SQL Server. Code running from within unsafe assembly can call unmanaged code. In other words, when you use unsafe, it means that you are giving it absolute freedom to access any resource. And if that software, that code is malicious, it can do a lot of damage. Now, so we're saying okay. We've talked about importing and configuring assemblies. The next part is now importing and configuring these assemblies. The creation of the assemblies will be done in the programming language, such as Visual Basic, C# and so on. But once you have done that and compiled that, then you can import and configure these assemblies. Now, an example. You need to create a managed database object to validate the credit card number of a customer. You have created a managed code and created a .NET assembly with this name, credit card validation.dll. To import this assembly, use this code, create assembly, credit card validator. That's the name that we want to use, which is here. From, and this is the file location and the file name or identifier. And those are the permissions we have set. We have set it to save. You can update an assembly to refer to the recent version of the assembly file or to update the permissions using author assembly statement. And that statement has this syntax: author assembly, credit card validator with permission set equals external access. So basically what we have done is we have taken this assembly, which we created here, which we imported here, and we have changed the permission from safe to external access. Importing and configuring assemblies, example continued. While creating an assembly using external access or unsafe permission set, you may get an error message to the effect that this code is not permitted to run in this environment. What you need to do is to use the statement author database AdventureWorks set trustworthiness on. So you run this statement to change the security label of the entire database so that you can allow external access and unsafe permission. Because remember, these give considerable access to the assemblies, access to the network, access to registry, environmental variables, and so on. So by default, these are not enabled. Okay, we've talked about authoring. You can also drop or delete assemblies by using drop assembly statement to delete an assembly, and just simple like that. Drop assembly credit card validation, for example. Okay, another question to see what we are looking at. Which of the following permissions will you use to call unmanaged code? A, safe, B, external access, C, unsafe. Chris, you seem to be taken up with your phone. I don't know what's so special about it. What's so special about that? What you're looking at? Okay. Yes, the answer is unsafe. Okay. So that's unsafe. Unmanaged code. You can only run it if you change the permission to unsafe. Okay, creating managed database object. To create managed database objects that use the managed code provided in the assembly, first enable the CLR integration feature in your database. And to do that, you use sp_configure CLR underscore enabled, comma 1. When you see a statement like this, what does it say about this part? What type of database object is this? We have come across another one when we are renaming databases. Well, you can comment on that, but I mean this, when you have sp_config, what do you deduce from that? What does it say to you? What should come immediately to your mind when you say that? What type of object are we dealing with? SP, stored procedure. It's a stored procedure, but more than that, this is a system stored procedure. It comes with SQL Server installation, just like the one we use for renaming databases. It's a system stored procedure. Okay. After that, you need to run the following statement. So we're talking about if you are going to create managed objects, you write the code in the language, .NET supported language, you import it, but now you want to be able to create an object in your database, because remember we said that SQL Server cannot allow these assemblies to be executed in the database environment. It doesn't allow. Okay. So before you can run them, you need to create a database object which is going to be based on that assembly that you have imported. Okay. Now, we're saying before you can do that, you need to enable the common language runtime integration feature in the database. So the first step is you change the configuration by running this statement. Number 2, you execute this command, reconfigure. You need to use the following namespaces found in .NET based libraries. I'm not going to go into details of this. Basically, when this statement, namespace is names of libraries which you can import into your which we can import to make use of certain functionalities which are available in them. Okay, and there are 3 of them: the system.data.sql client, system.data.sql.types, Microsoft.sql server. So you make use of these, you import these into your library. If you want to know more about them, just search, go to Microsoft documentation on SQL Server and you find a lot of information. Okay. So once you have done that, then you can go ahead now and create the managed stored objects. Okay. And among those objects, we have stored procedures. So to create stored procedures, remember we said that first you create the code that to implement the functionality that you want in the language that is supported by .NET framework. 2, you compile that into an assembly. 3, you import the assembly into SQL. Now you have to create an object based on that imported assembly. Okay. So the first one is stored procedures. And to do that, there are only 3 steps. In fact, for all of them, just 3 steps. One, you create a .NET class that implements the functionality of the stored procedure. Then compile the class to produce a .NET assembly. Okay, I'm going over this. You register that assembly in SQL Server by using the create assembly statement or import. Okay. Third, you create a stored procedure and associate the stored procedure with the actual methods of the assembly. I'm not going to go into the details of how you actually create that. But here is the syntax. To create a managed stored procedure by using an imported assembly, use the create procedure statement. It's similar to what we've been looking at, except for this part here, where I say as external name, assembly identifier, and type, and method. One of the, for object-oriented programming, one of the common ways in which you can access attributes and methods of objects is by the means of what is called the dot operation. So you have the name of the object followed by dot, then the attribute or the method or the function. Okay. So loosely speaking, let me give this illustration. If you're using C# and you want to access maybe what your user has typed in the text box on a form, you type the object there is the name of the text box, dot, then the property which is used to store data entered in the text box, which is text. But you can also have a method. For example, a command button. You want to do something when the command button is clicked or double clicked. And so you have the name of the command, sorry, object, dot, then the method, such as double click or whatever. This is the same format that is followed by things like string operators or manipulation or arrays. Name of the array, then dot, then what you want to do. Do you want to pop off, take out the last entry from the array? Do you want to add, and so on? So this is the common syntax, dot operator. If you have an object which is inside another object, and you want to access the attribute of the embedded object, then you have to start with the outer object, dot the embedded object, dot the attribute. And that's what we have here. Okay, here's an example of a managed stored procedure. Create assembly handling Lubu SINGCL from, that's the location, the file location and the file name where the assembly is stored. As you can see, it turns .dll. Go, create procedure. Now we are creating a procedure. based on this, and we're going to give it the associated with the schema dbo dot get photo from db. Then we declare some variables as external name, and this is the name that we are assigning it. So that's a manage stored procedure. That is external manage stored procedure. Okay. The next is creating managed user-defined functions. Again, we did look at user-defined functions as UDF. It's the same procedure, 3 steps. Create .NET class that implements the functionality of the user-defined function, then compile that class to produce a .NET assembly. Number 2, register that assembly in SQL Server using the create assembly statement. Okay. That's importing. Register or importing. Once you have done that, then you create a user-defined function and associate it with the actual methods of the assembly. So let me just use, I don't have another example. Let me just use this one. So what we are saying is we have this as an assembly which has been created and has been imported into SQL Server by this statement here, create assembly up to go. And immediately you should recognize that this is a batch. Okay. Then the second batch is this one. Now you are creating an object. In this case, we are creating a stored procedure. In the next subsection, it's a user-defined function as an external name, then the name that you are going to assign to it. Triggers, it's the same again. Create .NET class that implements the functionality of the trigger that you want. Then compile that class to produce a .NET assembly. Number 2, register that assembly in SQL Server using the create assembly statement. Third, create a trigger and associate it with the actual methods of the assembly. And this is what we did here. This part where we say as, we are associating this object we are creating with what the functionality that we have imported from this assembly, which was created here. This part. Okay. User-defined data types. It's the same. 3 steps. Create .NET class that implements the functionality of the user-defined data type, then compile that class to produce the .NET assembly. Number 2, register that assembly in SQL Server using the create assembly statement. 3, create a user-defined data type and associate it with the actual methods of assembly. Here's a question on this section. When will you use managed code instead of T-SQL? A, when you need to write queries. B, when you need to access external resources. C, when you need to perform an administrative task on the database. That is B. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter.